They said I wasn't in the will. I sat there at my own father's funeral, listening to a lawyer list off everything. The house, the business, even his tools, and none of it had my name. Not one word. Just Linda, my stepmother, and Mark, my brother. But not me, I'm Claire, his youngest. The one who held his hand through chemo. The one who gave up everything when he got sick. They thought I'd sit quietly, swallow the betrayal, and just mourn. But Dad gave me something else, a box. Inside was a letter. And a different will. I kept it hidden for weeks, wondering if I should destroy it. Or use it. But sitting there, in that stiff black dress, while they divided up his legacy like vultures, I knew what he would have wanted me to do. And so I stood. My voice shook, but my heart didn't. And I said, "That's not the last thing he wrote. If you've ever been erased by your own family, if someone tried to take what was rightfully yours, tell me, what would you have done?" They passed the folder like it weighed nothing. I watched it move across the table. Glossy, official, cruel. A man in a gray suit cleared his throat. Alan Thompson's final testament, notarized 6 months ago, names his wife, Linda, and his son, Mark, as sole beneficiaries. The air left my lungs. Not even a mention. Not a token. Not a word. I stared down at the hands folded in my lap. They'd held his pills, his water, his trembling fingers in the last week. They'd tucked the blanket over his feet when the morphine made him shiver. "Claire." Mark whispered beside me. "Are you okay?" Okay. Was I okay? Dad was barely in the ground. And already, they'd buried the truth too. Linda sniffled delicately, as if she hadn't already moved his tools into the garage at her house. The one she locks now, even from me. She locked from the inside. She patted my shoulder. "Alan loved you, sweetheart. But he wanted things to be simple. Simple. Simple like being erased." I didn't speak. I stood. Walked out of the law office into cold January wind. The kind that slices through your coat and into your bones. My car smelled like him, a whiff of pipe tobacco from the glove box. I reached for the tiny wooden cigar box he gave me 6 weeks before he passed. "Open this when things don't feel right," he'd said, eyes watery from chemo. Inside, under old family photos and a birthday card, was the letter. And the real will. Signed, dated, written in his own hand. Notarized by his friend Dan, who worked at the county clerk's office. I kept it hidden. Not because I doubted him, but because I knew what they'd say about me. But now, I realized what it said about them that they thought I wouldn't. The drive back to my apartment took 17 minutes. I counted every red light, not because I was in a rush, but because I didn't want to walk into that silence again. The kind of silence that feels like a decision. Not peace, not rest, just absence. My dad's favorite mug still sat on the kitchen shelf. Measure twice, cut once. It read, in black letters now fading. I hadn't touched it since he passed. I poured myself coffee, black, no sugar, no cream. He used to say that adding anything ruined the point. Coffee's not dessert, Claire. It's work fuel. I left it steaming on the counter. I couldn't drink it. Not today. I sat at the table and opened my laptop. Email from a client, spam. An event reminder, probate hearing, Thompson Estate, Jan 17 at 10:00 a.m. I closed the lid. My hand shook more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just grief. It was something colder. I reached for the cigar box again. The wood felt warm against my palms, worn smooth from years on his nightstand. I ran my fingers along the edge, until they landed on the folded card tucked in the bottom. The same card he gave me on my 40th birthday, the day he told me to be brave, even when it's family you're standing against. He knew. Even then. He knew what Linda and Mark might do. What they were capable of. Not evil. just entitled. Like I was supposed to smile and stay grateful just for being remembered. I pulled out the will again. Dated 4 months ago. After his last hospital stay. Handwritten, signed. Witnessed by Dan Morrison, county clerk since 2004. It gave me the house, the land, his share of the contracting business. But more than that, it gave me back my place, the one they tried to erase. There's a difference between being included and being chosen. And Dad had chosen me. Quietly, deliberately, on purpose. I sat there for a long time, watching the steam rise from that untouched mug, wondering how long I'd been willing to disappear for the sake of peace. I used to think grief came in waves. But with Dad, it came in rooms. The hallway where I found his slippers still tucked beneath the radiator. The garage where his flannel coat still hung on a rusty hook. The back porch where he'd sip his coffee and watch squirrels raid the bird feeder. Sometimes, I'd open the fridge and see the jar of peach preserves he loved, and have to sit down before my knees gave out. It wasn't just that he was gone. It was how fast everyone else moved on. Linda changed the locks a week after the funeral, said it was for security. She didn't mention it to me. I found out when my key no longer fit. Mark texted me, asking if I could help clear out Dad's office. Not his tools. Just the filing cabinet. Nothing important in there. He wrote, "I'll toss it unless you want to come get it." Nothing important. That cabinet held every contract Dad ever signed. Notes in his handwriting. Invoices from jobs I'd walked with him on as a teen. And tucked in the back, a photo of us at my high school graduation. He'd looked so proud in that picture, even though I'd skipped the ceremony to drive him home early. The heat had gotten to him that day. I remembered pressing a cold bottle of water to the back of his neck, watching him smile through the pain. "Smart move, Claire. Bear," he'd said. "Not everyone needs a stage to feel seen." I never forgot that. And now, it echoed louder than ever. Because Linda and Mark, they didn't just want the house or the money. They wanted the narrative. The version where I was just the quiet daughter who showed up for visits, but didn't matter much in the end. But they forgot something. Quiet doesn't mean absent. And I never needed a spotlight to tell the truth. I just needed proof. And I had it. Tucked in that will. Folded in a card. Written in ink and intent. They wanted a clean story. A simple legacy. A version where I didn't exist. But Dad left a messier truth. And I was done pretending it didn't matter. I texted Susan late that night. "You still up?" She replied with a heart and a single word always. 20 minutes later, she was at my door with 2 paper bags. One with Thai takeout, the other with red wine. We sat on the floor of my apartment like we were 20 again. The food untouched. The wine poured, then forgotten. I told her everything, about the funeral, the will, the box, Linda's face, Mark's silence. Susan didn't interrupt. She just listened, nodding, eyes steady, like she was holding the pieces of me that kept slipping loose. When I finished, she let the silence sit for a beat. Then she said, "I knew something was off." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded pamphlet. It was the funeral program. The one Linda had handed out. Susan flipped it open and pointed to the second page. "See that?" My eyes scanned the text. There was a paragraph titled Legacy and Life. Alan Thompson was survived by his loving wife, Linda, and his son, Mark, who stood by him in his final days. That's all it said. No mention of me. Not even as a daughter. Not even as a name. It felt like being erased twice. "She told the printer you weren't comfortable being listed," Susan said quietly. I asked. "She said you were grieving privately and didn't want attention." Grieving privately? That's what they called it now. The silence. The shootout. The rewriting. I thought maybe you'd approved it. Susan added. But I kept a copy, just in case. I looked at her. This woman who'd been beside me through college heartbreaks, bad bosses, and every family holiday where I had to fake smile through the tension. You believed me, I said. She raised her glass. Always have, always will. Outside, the city was quiet. But inside me, something stirred. A line had been crossed. And this time, I wasn't going to let it go quietly. 3 days passed before I heard from Mark. He didn't call. He sent an email. Subject line, quick estate update. Just reading it made my stomach twist. He wrote like a stranger. Polite, professional, detached. He said the house was being appraised next Tuesday. Said Linda had asked the realtor to start prepping it for sale. Said I didn't need to come, but if I had belongings still there, now's the time to collect them. My belongings. I stared at the screen. I hadn't lived in that house for years, sure. But I was there every weekend for Dad's last 6 months. My coat still hung in the hallway. My books were still in the guest room. The mug I gave him for Father's Day was still in the cabinet. I replied with one line, I'll be there at 9, no greeting. No thanks. No signature. The next morning, I pulled into the driveway I once shoveled every winter. Linda's car was gone. The porch light was still on, though it was well past sunrise. I unlocked the side door, or tried to. The key didn't work. I paused. Tried again. It jammed, then caught. Just enough to open the door with a sharp nudge. Inside, the kitchen looked off. The photos had been rearranged. The picture of Dad holding me as a baby. Gone. Replaced by one of Linda and Mark at some beach I didn't recognize. I stood there for a moment. The coffee pot was gone. Dad's ceramic one. The one with the chipped handle. So was the old wall clock he loved. The ticking that used to echo in the morning silence. Gone. I walked into the living room. The recliner he'd died in had been removed. Not stored, not covered, just gone. A new area rug covered the floor. Lighter. Modern. Clean, too clean. It was like someone had been scrubbing away his memory. One item at a time. I stood there, suddenly unsure of why I'd even come. But then, on the hallway console, I spotted something familiar. A copy of the will. Not the one he gave me. The other one. Folded, printed, crisp. Next to it was a yellow legal pad. Linda's handwriting. I recognized the looping L's. At the top of the list. Alon's tools, donate or discard. Claire's boxes, storage or trash. Mailbox key, change locks. And underlined, in bold red ink, OFALTL, I picked up the legal pad. The ink was fresh. Too fresh. She must have written it yesterday, maybe this morning. There were check marks next to nearly everything. Furniture. Finances. Photo albums. And my name. Claire's boxes, storage or trash. I stood there, holding my breath like it might keep the words from being real. Storage or trash. As if those were the only options. Like I'd been reduced to a pile of things, not a person with a history, and a father who chose me. I walked down the hall, each step heavier than the last. The guest room was half empty. My books were gone. The shelf where Dad used to keep his contractor manuals. Bare. A single photo remained of me and Dad, fixing the deck. Both of us in paint, splattered jeans, holding screwdrivers like trophies. It was face down on the windowsill. I turned it over gently. The frame was cracked at one corner. The glass slightly chipped. Someone had tried to toss it. Then changed their mind. Or forgot. I took it with me. Across the hall, the office door creaked open. Dad's filing cabinet still stood in the corner. Mark hadn't gotten to it yet. I opened the top drawer. Contracts, receipts, sticky notes in Dad's handwriting. Everything where it always had been. except the folder labeled Claire, private. Gun. I searched every drawer. Checked beneath the bottom panel, where Dad used to hide birthday cards and cash. Nothing. Then I noticed the trash bin under the desk. Crushed folders. Torn envelopes. One scrap caught my eye. Blue ink on yellow paper. I pulled it out and smoothed it on the desk. It was the top half of a sticky note, Dad's handwriting. The last word still intact? Your name on the deed. Claire. My hands went cold. Someone had torn it. Intentionally. I looked around the room like it might answer back. But it only stood there, stripped of meaning, like they wanted it, like they'd rather pretend I was never in this house at all. I folded the photo and the scrap of note into my coat pocket. Then I closed the cabinet, quietly, because if they were going to erase me, I was going to leave breadcrumbs, proof. One piece at a time. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard the garage door open. The slow grind of metal, followed by the smooth hum of Linda's Lexus. I didn't move. Didn't hide. I just stood in the hallway, holding that cracked photo like a shield. She walked in through the side entrance, juggling grocery bags and her oversized handbag. When she saw me, she froze. Claire, she said, blinking like I'd startled her in her own home. I didn't know you were stopping by today. I raised an eyebrow. You changed the locks. She smiled. A tight, practiced smile. Oh, that. Mark said the old key was sticking. Safety first. I didn't respond. Her gaze dropped to the photo in my hand. I was going through things. She said, walking past me. Decluttering. It's what your father would have wanted. Would he? I followed her into the kitchen. She set the bags on the counter, carefully avoiding my eyes. You're welcome to take whatever you feel attached to, she said, her tone light. I know some of those items have sentimental value. Like the will. Her hands paused mid-unpacking. She looked up slowly. Measured. The will was finalized. Alan made sure of that. I have another one. The words landed between us like a dropped plate. Not loud, but unmistakably sharp. She said nothing at first. Then, that's not possible. He wrote it. He signed it. Dan Morrison witnessed it. 4 months ago. Her mouth tightened. Claire, I know this has been hard on you. No. I cut in, gently. This has been hard on truth, on memory, on decency. Not just me. She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. Don't worry. I'm not here to fight. Not yet. I set the photo on the counter between us. The house can be appraised. The locks can be changed. But he chose me. And you can't erase that. Then I walked out. Past the chair she'd moved. Past the rug she'd replaced. Past the kitchen that no longer smelled like coffee and sawdust. And I knew this wouldn't be the last time we stood on opposite sides of his legacy. But the next time, I wouldn't walk away. The county clerk's office sat at the edge of Main Street, across from the library Dad used to take me to as a kid. I parked beside the hydrant, engine still ticking. The cigar box was on the passenger seat. I hadn't opened it again since that night. Didn't need to. I could feel the weight of the will, even through the lid. Inside, the place smelled like old paper and fresh toner. A young man behind the desk smiled without looking up. Morning. Name? Claire Thompson, I said. I'm here to confirm a notarized will, signed by Dan Morrison. He finally looked up. You'll want records. Down the hall. First door on your right. The hallway buzzed with flickering lights. I found the door, knocked, and entered. Dan sat behind a desk stacked with manila folders. Same gray hair. Same corduroy blazer. Same calm eyes I remembered from church picnics and school fundraisers. He looked up and smiled faintly. Claire. I nodded. He stood to shake my hand. I'm sorry about Alan. He was one of the good ones. I swallowed hard. He trusted you. Dan gestured for me to sit. I need to ask something? I said, placing the folded will on his desk. Do you remember witnessing this? He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the page. Then he nodded. Yes. 4 months ago, he asked me to come to his house. Said it was time to put things in writing, in his own way. Did he seem confused? Pressured? Dan shook his head firmly. Alan was sharp, tired, yes, but clear. He knew what he wanted. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Thank you. He leaned back, fingers tapping the desk. Why? What's going on? I hesitated. Then I told him. About the funeral, the official will, Linda, Mark, the erased program, the list. Dan's jaw tightened. That's not what he told me. What did he say? Dan leaned forward. He said, and I quote, "This one's not for the lawyers. This one's for the person who actually showed up." My throat burned. Do you have a copy? I asked. Dan nodded. I scanned it the day I signed, for record keeping. Want me to pull it? Yes. Please. He turned to his computer, typing steadily. And that's when he said it. Strange. Someone requested a search for Alan's name last week. From the clerk's admin login. I froze. Who? He frowned. I can't tell exactly. But it wasn't me? And it wasn't you. Dan clicked again. The screen glowed pale blue against the window's winter light. I can't give you names, he said, voice low. But I can tell you it wasn't a routine query. Whoever accessed Alan's file had elevated clearance. I leaned in. You're saying someone inside the clerk's office? Dan hesitated. Then gave a slow nod. Someone with admin credentials. Or someone using them. My stomach turned. How far can they go? Could they remove things? He studied me for a beat. They could, but they didn't. Your father's will is still in the system. Officially logged, time-stamped, encrypted. But. He clicked again. There's a flag on the file. A request for review, marked urgent. It's been pending since last Thursday. That was the day after the funeral. I sat back, pulse thrumming. Someone was trying to bury his words, again. Not by shredding paper, but by burying them in systems. In silence. Dan pushed a printed copy of the will across the desk. Take this. It matches the one you brought. I'll mark it as requested by family. I took it carefully, like it might break. Thank you, I said. He nodded once. Claire, he really did trust you. I left the building with that paper tucked close to my chest. The wind had picked up. Dry leaves scraped across the sidewalk. It sounded like whispers, frantic, urgent, unfinished. At home, I placed the printed will inside the cigar box, next to the original. 2 copies now. 2 versions of the same truth. I pulled out my notebook and wrote the date. Then I started listing things. What I knew. What I'd found. What was missing. At the bottom of the page, I wrote one sentence. Someone on the inside is helping them. I didn't want to believe it. Not fully. But I'd seen how far Linda was willing to go. And Mark, he wasn't cruel. But he was passive. The kind of man who looks away when it's more convenient than speaking up. I closed the notebook and stared at the box. Dad didn't believe in dramatic gestures. But he believed in backup plans. He once told me that trust wasn't about feelings. It was about foresight. People don't always mean to betray you, he'd said. They just don't stop it when it happens. Now I was beginning to understand what he meant. And maybe, just maybe, he'd left more than a will. The garage still smelled like motor oil and sawdust. It had been months since I stepped inside. Linda said she'd boxed everything up, but from the way the dust lay thick on every surface, she hadn't touched a thing. I flicked on the light. 1 bulb. flickering, buzzing faintly. Dad's workbench sat in the back, exactly as he left it. Tools lined up in precise rows. Tape measure, pliers, level, hammer. Above it, the old pegboard still held a hand-sketched diagram labeled Deck 2007. My chest tightened. That summer, we rebuilt the back deck together. He let me use the drill. Held the boards while I checked the angle. Never underestimate how fast things can come undone, he'd said, smiling. Level twice. Then trust it. I ran my hand along the edge of the bench, fingers brushing against a small tin box wedged beneath a shelf. It was his parts tin, random screws, washers, dead batteries. But something was tucked under it. A folded receipt. Gas station. Dated 7 weeks before his death. I nearly tossed it, until I saw what was scribbled on the back. His handwriting. Claire, if they pressure you, look behind the furnace. My heart jumped. I turned slowly. The furnace stood in the far corner, half covered by a dusty drop cloth. I pulled it back. Behind it, wedged in a shallow cavity in the drywall, was a manila envelope. Sealed with masking tape. My name on the front. I carried it to the workbench, hands trembling. Inside a USB drive, a list of names. And a letter. Not notarized. Not legal. Just a message from a father who knew too much and said too little. Claire, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm guessing things got messy. I hope I'm wrong. But just in case I'm not, this drive has a folder I labeled Insurance. Contracts I never filed. Emails I never sent. Voicemails I saved. Linda knows more than she says. And Mark, he stopped pushing back a long time ago. I'm sorry you're in this position. But if there's one thing I've always known, it's that you'll finish what I couldn't. Don't let them bury the truth, even if it comes wrapped in family. Love, Dad. I reread the last line 3 times. Even if it comes wrapped in family. Then I looked at the USB. And I knew. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a setup. And I wasn't walking into it blind anymore. The apartment was quiet when I returned. Too quiet. Not the kind that soothes. The kind that presses against your chest like wet wool. Heavy. Scratchy. Suffocating. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door. They clanged too loudly. Everything did lately. I didn't take off my coat. Just stood there, in the middle of the living room, staring at the space where sunlight used to fall in the mornings. Before I started pulling the curtains shut, I hadn't slept. Not really. Even when I closed my eyes, my mind kept replaying that list on Linda's yellow legal pad. Claire's boxes, storage or trash. Like I was a category. A decision someone else got to make. I sat on the edge of the couch, still holding the envelope. The USB drive was warm from my hand. I hadn't plugged it in yet. I couldn't. I needed a moment before I invited in whatever truth Dad had kept to himself. I reached for the blanket draped over the armrest. It smelled like lavender and dryer sheets. Soft, familiar, a lie of comfort. The TV remote sat beside me. I turned it on, just for noise. A home renovation show flickered to life. A woman was arguing with her contractor over cabinet handles. I muted it. Even their fake conflict felt too loud. I looked at the bookshelf across the room. The framed photo of me and Dad at the state fair was still there. I was holding a corn dog, laughing. He had that easy grin, the one he only used when he wasn't thinking about money or timelines or Mom. She wasn't in the picture. Neither was Mark. Just us. I hadn't realized how rare that was. How often I'd been edited out of my own family's narrative. Until I started looking for where I used to be. I stood and walked to the window, pulled back the curtain. The street below was quiet, empty. The kind of cold that makes everything look honest. Sharp edges. Bare trees. Unforgiving light. I touched the glass. It was colder than I expected, and it made me realize no one had called. not Mark. Not Linda. Not even a distant cousin with performative condolences. I hadn't just been erased from the will. I was being erased from the aftermath. The morning, the memory, the story, and the most painful part. They were doing it so easily. So quietly. Like I'd never been there at all. The call came just after midnight. My phone lit up on the kitchen counter, the screen glowing like a warning. Mark. I stared at it for 3 full rings before I answered. Claire. His voice was quiet. Measured. Like he was calling a colleague, not his sister. I didn't say anything. He sighed. I know things have been tense. Tense. That was the word he chose. Not cruel. Not calculated. Not betrayal. Tense. I repeated, flat. He ignored the bite in my tone. Linda's worried you might make things more complicated than they need to be. I let the silence stretch. Complicated. I echoed again. He cleared his throat. I'm just saying. Dad wanted peace. You know that, did he? I asked. Because peace doesn't usually come with erasure. Mark didn't respond. I saw the funeral program. I added. No mention of me? He hesitated. That was Linda's call. I didn't see it until it was printed. But you didn't object, I said. You never do. A pause. Then. She's grieving too, Claire. This isn't easy on any of us. My grip on the phone tightened. No, Mark. It's not. But some of us are grieving and being erased at the same time. He sighed again. This doesn't have to be ugly. I looked out the window. The city was quiet. But inside me, something sharp had turned. It already is, I said. He didn't argue. Didn't apologize. Just offered a final line, wrapped in brotherly politeness and corporate chill. Don't do anything you'll regret. And then he hung up. I stared at the screen, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Don't do anything you'll regret. Not. We can talk. Not. Let's find a way through this. Just a gentle warning that sounded a lot like a threat. I walked back to the living room. Sat down at my desk. I opened the notebook again, this time flipping to a clean page. At the top, I wrote, Rujirat isn tichi enem, irasurais. Then I plugged in the USB. The drive wired to life. A folder appeared on my screen. INSURAN seek inside, audio files, scanned documents, screenshots of emails. One titled Marka forwarded memo, PDF. I clicked it, watched it open. The first line read, Claire has no legal standing. Her copy isn't admissible. It was an internal email. From Linda. Forwarded to Mark. 1 week before the funeral. They weren't just hoping I'd stay quiet. They were preparing for war. And I'd been grieving like we were still family. I didn't sleep that night, but I didn't pace. Didn't cry. Didn't spiral. I documented. Every file from Dad's drive. I backed up twice. Once to an encrypted cloud folder, once to a new USB I labeled with a red sticker, fire only if attacked. It was something he used to say, half joking, when I'd ask why he kept receipts from clients who paid in cash. Insurance, kid. You don't need it until someone pretends you don't exist. Now I understood just how serious he was. By sunrise, I had 3 folders. 1 legal will, 2 digital evidence, 3 erasure pattern. Under the last one, I dropped photos of the funeral pamphlet, screenshots of Linda's list, and a PDF copy of the email Mark received about discrediting my will. I also started writing a timeline. Not for court, not yet. For me. Because memory can play tricks when people gaslight you long enough. You start doubting the order of things. What came first? Who said what? How much of it was real? I needed facts, laid out, undeniable. At 9:02 am, I called Diane Vasquez. She was a lawyer Dad had once mentioned. Estate disputes. Quiet but ruthless. The kind of woman who never raised her voice. But no one ever interrupted. I left a voicemail. Clear, calm, brief. Hi. My name is Claire Thompson. My father passed recently, and I have reason to believe there's a contested will. I have documentation, witnesses, and digital records. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in the truth. I hung up, paced the length of the kitchen once, then again. At 9:24, she called back. Claire, she said, voice low, smooth, unhurried. I've got an opening at noon. Can you be here? Yes, I said instantly, then paused. I mean yes. Thank you. She gave me the address, a modest office near the courthouse. No marble lobby, no polished receptionist. Just a name on frosted glass, Diane Vasquez-esque. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and lemon disinfectant. Efficient, clean, unsentimental. She met me at the door herself. Late 40s, sharp suit, no makeup. A woman who had no interest in performance, just results. She extended a hand. Claire, come in. Bring everything. I did. Laptop, USBs, printed documents, and the cigar box. Diane sat across from me at a plain wood desk. No family photos. Just a single brass scale sitting behind her. I took that as a good sign. Start from the top, she said, uncapping a pen. Leave nothing out. So I did. From the moment the will was read at the funeral, to Linda's list, to Dan Morrison's confirmation, to the hidden envelope behind the furnace. She listened without interrupting. Took notes in shorthand, quick and neat. Nodded only once. When I said the phrase, "They're rewriting the story." When I finished, she didn't speak for a moment. Then she leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said, "This is strong." I blinked. "You believe me?" She tilted her head. "I don't do belief, Claire. I do proof. And what you've got? It's credible. It's thorough. And frankly, it's cleaner than most cases I've taken to court." Relief crawled up the back of my neck. It didn't feel like a victory. Just less alone. "Here's what happens next," Diane continued. "We file a preliminary notice to the court that a competing will exists. That freezes the estate process temporarily." "Will they know it's me?" I asked. "Eventually, yes. But not today. And by the time they do, we'll be ahead." She handed me a sheet. "Sign here to retain me as counsel. I'll need a scanned copy of the handwritten will and the notary's contact." I nodded. She watched me sign. Then she said something that lodged itself in my ribs and stayed there. "You're not being dramatic. You're being methodical. There's a difference. Let them confuse the tomb, and we'll use it against them." By the time I stepped back into the afternoon light, the weight in my chest had shifted. It wasn't gone. But it had shape now. Direction. Edges I could name. I walked 2 blocks before I even realized I'd left my car behind. In my coat pocket, Diane's retainer agreement, folded clean and sharp. In my inbox, a confirmation notice of intent to contest will filed. Just like that, the silence was broken. Legally. Officially. Irrevocably. I sat at a bench outside the courthouse, watched a line of sparrows hop along the sidewalk like they had somewhere to be. Dad used to say truth doesn't shout. It shows up. Early. Prepared. Patient. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't here to humiliate Linda, or force Mark into some televised confession. But I was done pretending their version of Dad's story was the only one that mattered. He didn't raise me for show. He raised me for storms. Back at the apartment, I pulled up the insurance folder again. Clicked through the files slowly this time, each one confirming what I already felt in my bones. There were dates. Emails. Voice notes. Even a photo of a handwritten memo in Linda's planner. Push Mark to finalize paperwork. CLAR will fold if it gets legal. They were betting on my silence. Betting I'd break before they did. But this time, they'd bet wrong. I emailed Diane a summary of the digital evidence. She replied within minutes. "Good. We'll use this to request a hearing. I'll handle the filing. You prepare yourself. Prepare myself. That part hung in the air, because justice doesn't just demand evidence. It demands presence. And presence means being seen, heard, stood behind. By no one but yourself, if that's all you have. So I opened a new file on my laptop. Labeled it Statement if they make me speak. Because maybe I wouldn't have to. Maybe the documents would be enough. But if they tried to spin it, to twist what Dad left into something selfish or weak. I wanted the truth, in my own words, ready to meet them. No apologies, no softening, just clarity. Because this wasn't about money. It never was. It was about voice. And mine had been quiet long enough. The letter went out on a Wednesday. Diane drafted it in under an hour. 2 pages. No threats. Just facts. She called it a formal courtesy notice. I called it a line in the sand. Sent via certified mail to both Linda and Mark, and, blind, copied to the estate attorney who'd read the original will at the funeral. Inside, it stated clearly a second will exists. Legally notarized. With credible supporting documentation. Claire Thompson has retained counsel. Any attempt to distribute or liquidate assets prior to review may constitute interference with estate proceedings. It was signed, stamped, tracked. And now, it was real. No more pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen. No more watching from the doorway while they packed up Dad's life and crossed my name off the ledger. I didn't tell anyone I sent it. Not even Susan. I needed the silence, just for one more day, to feel mine again. But the response came sooner than expected. That evening, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring. Voicemail picked up. And then I listened. It was Mark. Claire, I saw the letter. What are you doing? This doesn't have to be public. We can fix this. Talk. Please don't escalate. He sounded tired. No outrage. No insults. Just the voice of someone who finally realized I wasn't bluffing. But it was too late for talk. Too late for fix. I forwarded the voicemail to Diane. She responded 5 minutes later. Standard pressure tactic. Do not engage. Let's proceed. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I doubted her. But because, somewhere in the echo of Mark's voice, I heard the boy I used to play Legos with. The brother who used to sneak me extra Oreos when Mom wasn't looking. But that version of him had stayed in the past, when the money showed up, and the silence became convenient. And I wasn't going to carry both our regrets anymore. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, cursor blinking on a blank email. Diane had offered to draft it, but I said no. This had to come from me. The address was easy enough to find. Paul Dyer, estate attorney. He'd been the one in the pressed suit, reading Dad's final wishes, while never once looking at me. Subject line supplemental will, disclosure, Alan Thompson Estate. I type Mr. Dwyer, I am writing to formally notify you that a second will, dated 4 months prior to Alan Thompson's passing, exists and has been verified as legally witnessed. As of yesterday, a notice of intent to contest has been filed with the probate court. My counsel, Diane Vasquez, will be handling all legal communication moving forward. I am attaching a courtesy copy of the handwritten will and notarization record. Please refrain from further asset allocation, public representation of sole beneficiaries, or estate liquidation until this matter is resolved in court. Respectfully, Claire Thompson. I reread it twice. It didn't shake. It didn't accuse. It just stood. Like a wall where there'd only been air. I clicked send. Then I leaned back and exhaled. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't fear. It was placement. Like something had finally settled after floating out of reach for too long. 10 minutes later, my inbox chimed. Paul had replied. Claire, I acknowledge receipt. I will inform my clients accordingly. Please direct all additional correspondence through Ms. Vasquez. PD. No emotion. No denial. Just the sound of a man covering his tracks, now that someone had pulled the lights on. I sent the email chain to Diane. She responded simply. Now we plan the forum. The forum. I repeated out loud. She meant the format, the timing, where this truth would first appear and how. A private hearing. A deposition. A press filing. I didn't care. What mattered was this. They couldn't keep calling it a misunderstanding. They couldn't say I imagined it. Or that grief had twisted my memory. The words were real. The signature was real, and I had stopped being the girl who asked permission to be believed. The meeting with Diane was short, precise, unapologetically strategic. She closed the file and said, "We push for a preliminary hearing." When? I asked. 2 weeks. Judge Marino's docket opens then. She slid a copy of the filing across the table. Typed in bold I. Petitioner Claire Thompson matter. Secondary will presentation, Alan Thompson estate request, emergency review prior to asset disbursement. I traced the words with my eyes, not my hand. I want them to hear it in their own voices, I said. Diane nodded. Will request they read their statements aloud. Let them say out loud what they tried to bury. She didn't blink when she said it. Didn't soften the edges, and that was exactly why I trusted her. What if they try to settle? I asked. They won't, she said flatly. Not yet. Linda doesn't settle. She dominates. And Mark won't move unless she tells him to. I folded my hands in my lap. This isn't about winning anymore, I said. I know, Diane replied. This is about unerasing. She stood, collected the folders, and looked at me. You ready for what comes next? I didn't hesitate. I was ready the day they read the wrong will. Later that evening, back in my apartment, I pulled out Dad's watch from the cigar box. It wasn't expensive. It didn't even work anymore. But when I held it, I felt something steady. Not time, but intention. He had seen this coming. Not the exact betrayal, but the pattern. The way people rewrite the ending to suit their comfort. Not this time. I took a photo of the watch and the signed will side by side, then attached it to a draft email titled, "For release if challenged." I didn't send it. Not yet. But I knew I would. Because this wasn't just about inheritance. It was about voice, memory, and proof. And I wouldn't let them walk away thinking silence meant surrender. The courthouse conference room was smaller than I expected. No mahogany benches, no gables, just a round table. 3 chairs on each side, a clock ticking too loudly on the far wall. Linda arrived first, hair pulled tight, dressed in navy. Minimal jewelry, no smile. She didn't look at me, just adjusted her folder as if she were early to a board meeting. Mark came next. He looked older than I remembered. Paler. Not worn down by grief, but by fear of what might finally be said out loud. Diane sat beside me, calm as a surgeon before the first incision. The estate judge, Marino, entered quietly. Gray suit. No robe. She didn't waste time. We are here to determine whether a second will exists, and whether its validity is sufficient to pause disbursement. That was it. No ceremony, no sentiment. Just structure. Ms. Thompson, the judge said, turning to me. Would you like to present your documentation? I nodded. Unzipped the folder. Pulled out the original handwritten will. Then the notarization certificate. Then the confirmation from Dan Morrison, each page stacked carefully. I also have a digital backup, I said, sliding the USB across the table. Marino raised an eyebrow. Diane spoke for the first time. The drive contains time-stamped files, including scanned copies, voice memos from Mr. Thompson, and internal communication suggesting intent to suppress the secondary will. Linda shifted. Not a flinch, but enough. Marino turned to her. Mrs. Thompson, do you dispute this? Linda cleared her throat. My husband was ill. He spoke often of adjusting things, but he never acted formally. Mark chimed in. We were told by Paul, our attorney, that the last signed will was 6 months prior to his death. Diane cut in smoothly. The handwritten will is dated 4 months prior, and notarized by a verified legal witness. Marino looked at Linda again. Did you know of this document? Linda hesitated. It was only a second. But in that silence, I knew the truth had finally touched the room. She chose her words carefully. I had my doubts, but I never saw that version. Not a denial. Just distance. Marino nodded. I'll review all evidence and determine whether a formal probate freeze is required. You'll be notified within 10 days. She stood. So did we. And just like that, the room dissolved. No verdict. But something had already shifted. Because now, the truth was in the open, and they couldn't pretend it hadn't been said. That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove past the grocery store where Dad used to buy cinnamon rolls every Sunday, past the hardware shop where his name was still scribbled on a dusty clipboard marked Trusted Contractors. I turned down Maple Drive, the street where we'd lived when I was 8. I hadn't been there in years, but the house was still there. Same pale siding, same cracked walkway. Someone else lived there now. A kid's bike leaned against the porch. The porch Dad built by hand. He once told me, you don't build to be remembered. You build so someone else has a place to stand. I parked for just a minute. Didn't get out. Just sat there, letting it all settle. I'd said the words. I'd shown the proof. I'd taken my seat at the table. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel invisible. Back at the apartment, there were 3 missed calls. 1 from Mark. 2 from numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't call back, but then a text came through, from Aunt Rachel, Dad's oldest sister. We hadn't spoken in over a year. I just heard what's happening. I had no idea. Your father would be proud of you. I stared at the screen. Not because I needed the approval, but because someone had finally said it out loud. I opened my email. One unread message from a neighbor of Dad's. Subject line. You're not crazy? Inside. I remember your dad talking about that second will. Said he didn't trust how Linda was handling things. He said, Claire's the one who showed up when it mattered. Thought you should know. I sat back. Truth has a strange gravity. It starts quiet, unassuming, easy to ignore, but once it's in the air, it pulls people toward it. Some to fight, some to flee, but some, finally, to speak. Mark showed up at my apartment the next morning. No warning, no message. Just the sound of his knuckles against the door. 2 knocks, then quiet. I opened it without a word. He looked tired. Not the performative kind. The kind that sets into your shoulders when something's finally too heavy to carry quietly. I won't stay long, he said. I stepped aside anyway. He didn't sit. Just stood by the bookshelf, staring at a photo of me and Dad at the lake. Dad's arm around my shoulder. Both of us squinting in the sun. I remember that weekend, he said. Dad made me sleep in the tent because I forgot the propane. I didn't smile. He turned back to me. You were right. The words didn't land like a victory. Just stillness. I read the second will, he said. Diane sent it. I read every word. I waited. He swallowed. I knew about it. Not when he signed it, but later. A week before he died, he told me he'd changed things. Said it felt more honest. And you said nothing, I said. I told Linda, he admitted. And she said he was medicated. Said he didn't know what he was doing. I didn't push. Of course he didn't. That was always the shape of our family. One person pushed. The other disappeared. I didn't think you'd fight, he added. That part, at least, felt honest. I took a slow breath. Now you know better. Mark looked down, fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, then met my eyes. She wants to settle. That surprised me. She'd never admit it out loud, he added. But she's nervous. She thinks the judge will side with you. She's right, I said quietly. Mark gave a small nod. I just thought you should hear it from me. He turned to go. Paused at the door. I don't expect forgiveness, Claire. But I never wanted it to be this. I looked at him. At the brother who once defended me on the school bus. Who built Lego towers beside me for hours, and who, somewhere along the way, decided silence was easier than truth. I know, I said. And I meant it. But that didn't make it okay. He left without another word. I watched the door close. And I knew. This wasn't about punishing him. It never had been. It was about standing in the space they tried to clear of me, and refusing to move. The first morning in the new house, I woke up before the sun, not from nerves, not from dread, just because it was quiet, the good kind. No thin walls, no anxious texts, no ticking clock in the hallway reminding me of everything that had been taken. Just quiet. The kitchen was still half in boxes, but the coffee maker was plugged in. Dad's mug sat on the counter. Measure twice. Cut once. I filled it. Black. No sugar. No cream. He'd approve. I stood at the window while it brewed, watching the street wake up. A kid on a bike. A man walking his dog in flannel pajama pants. A woman dragging her trash can back from the curb. Life, undramatic, ongoing. This house wasn't big, wasn't flashy. But it was mine. Paid for, in part, by the settlement I didn't ask for, but accepted. Not for the money. For what it meant. For what it corrected. They never apologized. Not really. Linda's legal team signed the agreement with all the warmth of a DMV clerk. Mark sent me a short email after, "Thank you for being fair." I didn't reply. Because fairness wasn't the gift. It was the demand. I kept Dad's level. The Stanley one, on a shelf by the back door. Not hidden. Not for show. Just there. Because some tools aren't meant to be boxed away. Susan helped me move. She brought over frozen lasagna, a bottle of wine, and a candle labeled "Second Chances." We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The guest room had real sheets now. A lamp, a stack of old library books I'd promised myself I'd finally read. And in the living room, beside the window that faced east, I placed the photo of me and Dad at the lake. Not framed. Just propped against a jar of dried lavender. It didn't need to be announced. It just needed to exist, like me. The days began to find their rhythm. Morning coffee. Short walks to the mailbox. Afternoons with my laptop open, a candle burning low, and no one asking where I was or who I should be. I started baking again. Just small things. Banana bread, blueberry scones. The smell filled the kitchen and stayed through dusk. It reminded me of the weekends Dad used to patch drywall while I tried to make cinnamon rolls from a box. He'd pretend they were perfect, even when they collapsed in the middle. I left the front porch light on every night. Not because I was waiting for anyone, but because I could. Some choices, when you finally get to make them, feel like power even when they're quiet. I got a card from Dan Morrison. Handwritten. Claire. Alan talked about this house. Said he hoped you'd end up somewhere with light. You did. You earned more than they gave. Keep the rest. Dan, I read it twice, then slid it between the pages of Dad's old ledger. The one with unpaid invoices, scribbled notes, phone numbers from 10 years ago. It smelled like pencil shavings and drywall dust. I didn't throw it away. I donated the rest of Dad's tools to a local trade school. Except the level. And one hammer with his initials etched faintly into the wood. Some things aren't meant to be passed down. They're meant to stay near. Susan visited every Sunday. She'd bring some gossip from the hospital, something sweet, and a new playlist she insisted I try. We didn't talk much about the case anymore. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was already finished. In the way things sometimes end, not with a bang, but with a better breath. Linda never reached out again. Mark sent one more email in March. Short. Mom's health isn't great. She asks about you. I didn't reply. Closure isn't cruelty. It's clarity. And I wasn't interested in reopening doors I'd spent years learning to close. That evening, I sat on the back step with a mug of tea, watching the sun melt into the neighbor's rooftop. The sky was that soft kind of gold you only get in spring. Warm enough to remember, quiet enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. The lavender I planted last week was already pushing through the soil. Just a few green shoots, but alive. Dad would have noticed. He always said the smallest things knew how to show up first. Inside, the house smelled like vanilla and sage. The record player was humming something old and honest. And the watch he left me ticked gently on the side table, no longer hidden in a box. Just there, where it belonged. I didn't win. I didn't need to. Because it was never about proving I was right. It was about refusing to disappear. And now, finally, I wasn't living in the echo of someone else's story. I was writing mine. One box unpacked. One window open. One name, mine, still standing. If you've ever rebuilt from something no one saw but you, share it below. What does legacy mean to you now? Where are you listening from tonight?